You're halfway through a stack of routine cases when your phone vibrates on silent. Traffic violations, contract disputes, small things that let you pretend the system still functions the way it was designed. You've spent years convincing yourself that law is structure, not power, that your role is to interpret, not decide outcomes beyond the text in front of you. You underline a clause, make a note about precedent, and reach for the next file. The message on your phone has no sender, just a time, an address, and a line that doesn't read like a request. Tonight decides whether a war begins. You ignore it at first. People send strange things to judges all the time: threats, pleas, delusions. You've trained yourself to separate noise from relevance. But then your clerk knocks, hesitates, and tells you there's a man downstairs insisting on seeing you. No appointment, no name, just a sealed envelope with your name written in a handwriting you don't recognize. You tell her to send him away. She doesn't move. He said if I don't bring this up, I should pack a bag and leave the city. You take the envelope. Inside is a single photograph. Your brother stepping out of his car that morning, time-stamped, precise, and a document you don't remember signing, authorizing a closed hearing under your jurisdiction for a case you've never seen. You feel something shift, not panic, not yet, but a recalibration. The system you trust doesn't produce unsigned orders or photographs of your family. You check your calendar. There's an empty slot tonight. Reserved, authorized by someone with credentials equal to yours. You go. The building isn't one you've ever entered before, but your credentials open the door. Inside, there's no signage, no clerks, no noise, just a corridor and a room at the end with a table, 3 chairs, and a file waiting in the center. You don't sit immediately. You read standing up. The file outlines 2 operations, both classified, both denied publicly. One is a covert strike authorized by a coalition that officially doesn't exist. The other is retaliation prepared by a state that claims it was attacked, though no attack has been acknowledged. Both sides have plausible deniability. Both have escalation protocols. Both are waiting.
There's no legal framework cited. No jurisdiction, no appeal process, just your name, your authority, and the implication that your decision will authorize or halt actions that could escalate into something far larger. You hear the door open behind you. The man who enters doesn't introduce himself. He doesn't need to. He sits, folds his hands, and looks at you like you're already part of something you haven't agreed to. You've been selected because you still believe in rules, he says. That makes you predictable. Predictability makes you useful. You ask him what authority allows this. He doesn't answer directly. Authority is a story, he says. What matters is whether people act as if it's real. You think about your brother's photograph, about the unsigned order that still passed every system check, about the empty slot in your calendar that somehow exists. What happens if I refuse, you ask? He tilts his head slightly, as if considering whether the question deserves an answer. Then someone else decides, and you become irrelevant, along with anything you hoped to protect. You sit. You read the file again, slower this time. The first operation targets a network of facilities suspected of developing weapons that violate every treaty you've ever cited in your courtroom. The intelligence is incomplete but compelling. The second operation is a retaliatory strike that will hit civilian infrastructure under the justification of deterrence. If the first strike happens, it might stop something catastrophic, or it might trigger the second. If you block it, the second might still happen, framed as a preemptive move. There's no clean outcome, only probabilities. You realize the structure of what's being asked. This isn't law as you've practiced it. There's no precedent to follow, no statute to interpret. This is judgment in its rawest form, decision without safety nets. What are the rules, you ask? The man finally smiles, but there's no warmth in it. You are the rules. You understand then that this isn't a one-time event. This is a position, a role that exists outside any official system, where decisions are made because someone has to make them, and no one wants to be accountable. You look at the clock, the time in the message. You have less than an hour. You start building a framework, because that's what you do when the world stops making sense. You list variables, assign weights, calculate likely outcomes. Civilian casualties, long-term destabilization, the credibility of treaties that only matter if someone enforces them, the risk of escalation into open conflict. You ask for more data. They give you just enough to confirm that both sides are prepared to act within minutes of your decision. Why me? You ask again, not because you expect a different answer, but because you need to understand the mechanism. Because you hesitate, the man says, and hesitation in this context means you're still thinking about consequences. You think about your brother again, about the photograph. You think about how easily someone inserted your authority into a system you believed was secure. You make a decision. You authorize a limited strike on the facilities, but you attach conditions, constraints that require confirmation at multiple stages, thresholds that halt the operation if certain variables shift. You're trying to introduce friction into a process designed for speed, to slow it down just enough that it doesn't spiral. The man reads your decision, nods once, and leaves. You sit alone in the room as the clock hits the time in the message. Nothing happens immediately. No alarms, no confirmation, just silence. Then your phone vibrates again. Decision executed. You go home that night knowing you've done something that doesn't exist in any record. You don't know the outcome yet. You don't know if your constraints held, if the strike was contained, if retaliation is already being prepared. You check on your brother. He's fine, unaware of how close he came to being leverage. You tell yourself this was an anomaly. It isn't. The next file arrives 2 days later. Different region, different actors, same structure. No legal framework, just competing actions waiting for a decision. You try to refuse the second time. You ignore the message, avoid the building, go through your normal cases as if nothing has changed. Then a journalist publishes a story about a leak, partial, fragmented, but enough to suggest that something is happening behind the scenes, enough to provoke reactions, enough to create pressure. You receive another photograph. This time, it's not your family. It's a hospital in a region mentioned in the file. Coordinates, a timestamp that matches a potential strike window. You go back. This time, you don't ask what happens if you refuse. You already know. You start to understand the system you're part of. It exists in the gaps between official decisions, where plausible deniability is more important than accountability, where outcomes matter more than process. You also start to understand your own role in it. You're not there to enforce law. You're there to manage escalation, to decide which risks are acceptable and which are not, to choose between bad outcomes and worse ones. You build a method. You track patterns across cases. You notice how certain actors respond to constraints and others ignore them. You identify thresholds that tend to trigger retaliation. You start thinking less like a judge and more like a strategist. Years pass, though you measure them differently now, not in time, but in decisions, in operations authorized or halted, in conflicts that stayed hidden and those that almost didn't. You keep a private ledger, not of outcomes, you're never given full confirmation, but of decisions. What you chose, why you chose it, what variables mattered.
You look for correlations, for ways to reduce uncertainty. You also keep track of the compromises. The first time you authorize an action knowing it will cause civilian casualties, you tell yourself it's to prevent something larger. The second time, the justification comes faster. By the 10th, you don't need to justify it as much, you just calculate. That realization scares you more than any threat. You try to draw lines, rules you won't cross, targets you won't approve, but the system adapts. Files arrive that test those lines, scenarios where refusing means allowing something worse. You start to see how power works at this level. It's not about control in the way you imagined. It's about responsibility without visibility. Decisions that shape events no one will ever trace back to you. One case stays with you longer than the others.
A small state is on the verge of collapse. Internal factions are backed by larger powers, each pushing for control. Intelligence suggests that if one faction gains dominance, it will trigger a regional conflict that could spread quickly. The proposed solution is surgical. Remove key leaders in multiple factions simultaneously. Destabilize the balance just enough to force a stalemate. It's precise, calculated, and it requires you to approve coordinated strikes in civilian areas where those leaders are located. You hesitate longer than usual. You request more data. You analyze potential alternatives. There aren't any that don't carry equal or greater risk. You think about the idea of justice that brought you into law in the first place, about fairness, due process, the right to be heard. None of those concepts exist here. Not in a way you can apply. You realize that what you're deciding isn't who is right or wrong, it's which version of the future is more acceptable. You approve the strikes, but you modify the plan, timing, targeting, conditions designed to minimize collateral damage. You know it won't eliminate it. The operation goes through. Weeks later, you see a report, public, incomplete, but enough to connect to your decision. The region stabilizes, temporarily. The larger conflict doesn't happen. You should feel relief. Instead, you feel the weight of knowing exactly what it cost. You start to question whether your presence is actually making things better or just making them more efficient. Whether the system uses your sense of morality to justify actions that would happen anyway. You test it. In one case, you deliberately delay a decision. You stretch the process, request more information, introduce uncertainty. The response is immediate, not from the man you met at the beginning, but from the system itself. Deadlines tighten, pressure increases. The file returns with fewer options, more urgency. You understand then that your role isn't to stop actions, it's to shape them. You adapt. You focus on influence rather than control. You design decisions that steer outcomes rather than dictate them. You look for leverage points, small changes that create larger effects. You also start to build relationships, though they're never acknowledged as such. You recognize patterns in how different actors respond to your constraints. You learn to predict which ones will comply and which ones will push boundaries. You become, in a way, a participant in the very system you once believed you stood outside of. Years into this role, you're no longer surprised by the files. You're not shocked by the scale of what you're asked to decide. What unsettles you now is how quickly you can process it, how efficiently you can move from information to decision. You remember the first night, the hesitation, the need to build a framework from scratch. Now the framework is internal, automatic. You start to wonder what you've lost. There's a moment that crystallizes it. A file arrives involving a conflict that's been ongoing for years, one you've influenced multiple times. Both sides have adapted to your patterns. They anticipate your constraints, design their operations to fit within them. You realize that your presence has become a variable in their strategies.
They're not just acting despite you, they're acting with you in mind. You're no longer just deciding outcomes, you're shaping behavior. The decision in this case is particularly complex. Any action you approve will reinforce the patterns both sides have developed. Any action you deny will force them to adapt in unpredictable ways. You see the possibility that your continued involvement might be stabilizing the system in a way that prevents resolution. That by managing escalation, you're also preventing any decisive outcome. You consider stepping away, for real this time, not just delaying a file, but refusing entirely. You think about what happens if you do. Someone else takes your place, someone with a different framework, different thresholds, different tolerances. The system doesn't stop, it adjusts. You make your decision, not just on the file in front of you, but on your role. You choose to stay, not because you believe you can fix it, but because you understand it, because you know the variables, the patterns, the leverage points, because leaving would mean surrendering that understanding to someone else. You accept that this is what you've become, the judge who decides the fate of hidden wars. You don't tell anyone. There's no one to tell. Your official life continues. You still sit in your courtroom, still handle cases that follow rules you can cite and defend. You maintain the appearance of normalcy because it's part of the system, because your legitimacy there reinforces your authority here. But you're always aware of the other layer, the files that arrive without record, the decisions that never appear in any judgment. You live with the consequences in fragments, reports, briefings, subtle shifts in global events that you recognize as outcomes of choices you made. You never get full closure, never a complete picture. You operate in uncertainty, guided by patterns and probabilities. And every time your phone vibrates with a new message, you feel the same recalibration you felt the first time. Not panic, not quite, but the recognition that something is about to be decided, and that decision will pass through you. You've learned to act quickly, to balance speed with consideration, to accept that hesitation has a cost, and so does action. You've also learned that there's no final resolution, no point where the system stabilizes enough for you to step away. Hidden wars don't end, they shift. And as long as they do, there will be someone in a room like that, with a file in front of them, making decisions that shape outcomes no one else sees. Right now, that someone is you. Your phone vibrates again. A new time, a new address, a new decision waiting to be made. You stand up, leave the stack of ordinary cases behind, and go.